26 leaders walked into that room in Brussels. 25 of them spent 90 minutes attacking one man. And then the woman who was supposed to be on their side said something that stopped the room. Giorgia Meloni. Prime Minister of Italy, leader of the third largest economy in the European Union. The woman Brussels spent years trying to absorb and neutralize. Looked at her colleagues and said she understood Orbán's position. According to 5 separate diplomatic sources cited by Politico, she said his stance was normal because things change. She said if she were in the same situation, she would understand it. The Italian government denied it. The words had already landed, and in that moment, in that one sentence from Rome, something shifted in the European Union that cannot be unshifted, because Meloni is not Orbán. She is not Fico. She is not a Eurosceptic rebel from a small country on the eastern fringe. She is the leader of 60 million Italians, a founding member state, and the head of the largest group in the European Parliament. When she says she understands, Brussels does not have a response ready. Here is what that sentence means, and here is what mainstream media will not connect to it. Let's go. To understand what happened in that summit room, you need to understand the shape of the European Union's internal coalition. Not the public statements, but the actual map of who agrees, with whom, and why. Brussels operates on a core assumption that the major Western member states, Germany, France, Italy, the Netherlands, form a reliable pro-integration majority that can always outvote the Eastern dissidents. Hungary is 8 countries away from that core. Slovakia is irrelevant without Hungary. But Italy is the third largest contributor to the EU budget. Italy is a G7 nation. Italy has the second largest manufacturing base in Europe. When Italy moves, even a millimeter, the entire coalition geometry changes. Meloni's statement was a millimeter, and Brussels knows what millimeters become. Now let's look at the summit itself, because the 90-minute confrontation with Orbán tells you everything about where the EU actually is, not where it claims to be. 25 leaders took turns. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz said all 27 member states must honor decisions made together. Belgian Prime Minister Bart de Wever called it unacceptable to agree and then refused to implement. Finnish Prime Minister Petteri Orpo said Orbán was using Ukraine as a weapon in an election campaign. Dutch Prime Minister Rob Jetten said the veto was unacceptable. EU Council President Antonio Costa said nobody could blackmail European institutions. 90 minutes. 25 voices. One man. And at the end of it, Orbán walked out, stood before the cameras, and said 6 words: if there is oil, there will be money. Not a single thing changed. The 90 billion remains blocked. The 20th package of sanctions against Russia remains blocked. And the man who blocked them flew home to campaign for re-election. But the story that nobody reported was not what Orbán said walking out. It was what Meloni said in the room. 5 diplomats confirmed it to Politico. The Italian Prime Minister's office issued a denial. Politico stood by its reporting. Here is the exact language attributed to her by diplomatic sources. She said Orbán's position was normal because things change, and that if she were in the same situation, she would understand it. Read that sentence with Italy's energy situation in mind. Italy imports roughly 40% of its natural gas. The Middle East war has already sent oil prices above $119 per barrel as Iranian attacks disrupted Qatari supplies. Italy's industrial sector, the second largest in Europe, is facing energy costs that are structurally higher than its competitors. Meloni's government has been quietly pushing for emergency national measures to cap electricity prices, and she secured language in the summit conclusions allowing for exactly that. When Meloni says she understands Orbán's position on the pipeline, she is not speaking ideologically, she is speaking arithmetically. Energy prices are a political existential question in Italy just as they are in Hungary and Slovakia. The difference is that Italy also publicly supports Ukraine, which means she's doing the same calculation Orbán is doing, weighing energy costs against foreign policy alignment, but doing it quietly, with diplomatic cover, while letting Orbán absorb all the pressure. That is not solidarity with Brussels. That is a more sophisticated version of the same position. Now let's add Fico. Because at the end of the summit, the Slovak Prime Minister announced that Slovakia was joining the blockade. Not conditionally. Not with caveats. Joining. Which means the veto now has 3 potential anchor points: Hungary, Slovakia, and a silent Italian sympathy. And Brussels' only strategy is to wait for April 12th to remove one of them. But as we covered in our previous video, Fico has already said publicly that if Orbán loses, Slovakia takes the veto. So removing Orbán from the equation does not remove the veto. It transfers it. And the Italian sympathy does not disappear because Hungarian voters made a different choice. This is the fracture that Brussels cannot seal. It is not a Fidesz fracture. It is not a Hungary fracture. It is an energy fracture. And energy fractures run through every economy in the European Union simultaneously. Now, let's talk about what the 90 billion number actually represents. Because it has been reported as a Ukraine support figure, and it is. But the internal architecture of it is what matters. 60 billion of the 90 billion is earmarked for weapons. Joint European debt, issued through EU mechanisms, financing military operations. The remaining 30 billion covers Ukraine's operational budget. Civil service salaries, infrastructure maintenance, basic government function. When you borrow 90 billion on joint debt and send 60 of it to fund weapons, every member state that signed that agreement becomes a co-financier of a military campaign. Their taxpayers are on the hook for interest payments regardless of how the campaign ends, regardless of whether the money achieves its objectives, regardless of whether the pipeline gets repaired, regardless of whether the election in Hungary produces a different government. Orbán's question, not his stated question, but his implicit one, is this: why should Hungary borrow money jointly with 26 other countries to finance a military campaign against a country that is blocking Hungary's oil supply? That is not a rhetorical question. It is a contract law question. And the answer from Brussels, a deal is a deal, does not address it, because the conditions under which Hungary signed that deal changed in January when the Druzhba pipeline went offline. Meloni understands this. 5 diplomats confirmed she said so in a closed room. Her government denied it because saying it publicly in Italy, where support for Ukraine is official policy, is politically costly. But understanding something privately and denying it publicly is not the same as disagreeing with it. It is the definition of a fracture operating below the surface. Now, let's look at the broader map, because Meloni and Orbán are not the only data points on it. In France, Marine Le Pen, currently appealing her conviction while leading in polls for the 2027 presidential race, has been vocal in her criticism of the 90 billion package. In Germany, Alternative for Germany holds roughly 23% in national polling. In the Netherlands, Geert Wilder's government is in coalition and has been one of the most cautious voices on unlimited Ukraine support. In Austria, the Freedom Party is now in government and has called for an end to sanctions on Russia. This is not a fringe position anymore. It is the governing position or the leading opposition position in Germany, France, Italy, Hungary, Slovakia, Austria, and the Netherlands simultaneously. That is not a minority within the EU. That is a majority of the EU's political energy, if not its institutional machinery. The institutional machinery still belongs to the Brussels core. Von der Leyen, Merz, Macron, Costa. The architects of the 90 billion package, the pipeline offer, the sanctions regime, the 5 scenarios for what happens if Orbán wins. The machinery is intact. The coalition that built it is cracking. And the crack that showed in Brussels on March 19th, when Meloni said in a closed room what half of Europe is thinking in private, is not a crack in Orbán's position. It is a crack in the assumption that the Western member states are a reliable monolith behind Brussels' strategy. They are not. And the summit proved it. Let's talk about what comes next. Because the April 12th election is 11 days away, and the story after April 12th depends entirely on which scenario plays out. If Orbán wins, and the 8 consecutive by-election victories for Fidesz while Tisza refused to contest any of them is a data point that every poll ignores, then the 5 Brussels scenarios activate. The gloves come off. Funding pressure increases. The legal mechanisms accelerate. And Orbán enters a second term with a Washington nuclear deal, a Fico veto backup, and an Italian prime minister who privately agrees with him. If Magyar wins, then Brussels gets the result it has been engineering toward for 3 months. The 90 billion unlocks. The sanctions renew. Hungary returns to compliance. And the EU machine declares victory. But Fico still holds the veto. Meloni's energy arithmetic does not change. The AFD, the FPO, the RN, Wilders. None of them lose their positions because Hungary changed its government. The fracture is not in Budapest. The fracture is in the premise that the EU can function as a unified actor when its member states have fundamentally different energy dependencies, different economic pressures, and different electorates demanding different things from their governments. Orbán did not create that fracture. He revealed it. And Meloni confirmed it in a closed room in Brussels on March 19th, in front of 5 diplomatic witnesses, while her office was already drafting the denial. That is the story no outlet connected after the summit. They reported the 90 minutes of criticism. They reported Orbán's unchanged position. They reported Fico joining the blockade. They reported Meloni's denial. None of them put those 4 facts in the same frame and asked the obvious question. If 25 leaders spent 90 minutes attacking one man and the only outcome was that 2 more countries hardened their positions and a 3rd privately sympathized, what exactly is Brussels' plan? The answer, as we have covered across multiple videos on this channel, is April 12th. The plan is the election. Everything else is managed pressure until the votes are counted. And if the votes do not produce the result Brussels needs, the fracture becomes a fault line. And fault lines, unlike cracks, do not stay quiet. Subscribe. 11 days. The map of Europe is being redrawn in real time, and you will want to understand it the moment it moves. Not 3 days later when the mainstream framing has already been built around it. The crack that started in Budapest is now visible in Rome. The question is where it shows up next. And here is the answer. The crack does not stay in one place. It moves to where the pressure is highest. Right now, the pressure is highest in 4 places simultaneously. Hungary. 11 days from an election that could confirm or remove the veto anchor. Slovakia, where Fico committed to holding the position regardless of Hungary. Italy, where Meloni manages a public pro-Ukraine stance while privately calculating energy costs. And Germany, where Merz proposed abolishing the unanimity principle. That last point deserves a moment. Merz called Orbán's veto a serious disloyalty and proposed switching to qualified majority voting. He said it publicly. In Brussels, with Macron's support. But qualified majority voting requires a treaty change. Treaty changes require unanimity. Hungary vetoes it. Slovakia vetoes it. And Italy has now privately signaled it understands why the veto exists. The machine Brussels is building to defeat Orbán's position requires the very legal architecture Orbán is using to block it. Every mechanism designed to remove his power runs through the consent he is withholding. This is not a paradox that resolves on April 12th. It is structural. The fracture is not ideological. It is arithmetic. Energy costs money. Money comes from somewhere. Somewhere has a limit. And when the limit is reached, people vote for whoever promises to lower their bills. Orbán promised that and delivered it. His voters pay less for energy than almost anyone else in Europe. Meloni promised it too, and quietly secured summit language, allowing national emergency measures. The difference between them is not the calculation. It is the volume. Orbán says it out loud, to 25 angry colleagues. Meloni says it in a closed room to 5 diplomatic witnesses, and issues a denial. The denial does not change the arithmetic, and 5 witnesses are enough. Subscribe. 11 days to April 12th. The crack that started in Budapest is now visible in Rome. This channel will track every movement, because the story of how Europe handles this fracture is the most important political story of this decade. You will want to understand what actually happened, not what Brussels says happened.